For anyone who's trying to access our internet, it is public free access, and the password is guest access. GUESTACCESS. I feel like we should be doing a cheer when we do that, but anyway, so you guys can get logged in while we're waiting. I just want everyone to know why we're waiting. We have a bus of about 30 patients that are circling the campus trying to get their way in here, so we think that it's important to wait for them to come in. So that's the reason why we're a little delayed, and I think we're going to be a couple minutes past the 10. So we do apologize, but we did want you to know why.
That's on.
All right, good morning, everyone. After a bit of a delay, we're ready to get started. So if you're standing around, if you could get seated. I can't tell you how excited and happy we are to have you here today. My name is Donna Lipscomb, and I'm with the Center for Biologics Evaluation, Outreach, and Development here at CBER. And I'll be the facilitator for today's meeting. I'm going to give my colleagues a chance to introduce themselves, but first I want to go over a few housekeeping rules for us today. We have several people on the web as well as in the room, and we just want to welcome everybody, especially our web participants. More and more of our meetings are happening virtually, and we're excited that we have an opportunity to share this information to people who couldn't make it. Your voice is important to us in this effort, and we really are looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I do want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded via the webcast and transcript, and it's going to be put up on our web sometime after this meeting. There are restrooms located. If you go out the door, turn right, go to the end of the hall and a little to the right. That's where they are. It's about as far away, so I would, ask that you judge the distance when you're deciding when it's time to go. There's a drinking fountain down there as well, and you pass the kiosk. So for anyone who did not bring their lunch, when we break for lunch, you'll be able to get a sandwich or some coffee from out there. Feel free at any time to get up and move around. This is an informal meeting in that we want you to be comfortable. If you need to stretch, walk around, please do so. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Ginette Michaud. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Blood Research and Review here in the Center for Biologics.
Good morning. Stephanie Omakaro, Medical Officer in the Office of Blood Research and Review, Division of Hematology Clinical Review.
Good morning, I'm Paul Mintz. I'm Director of the Division of Hematology Clinical Review in the Office of Blood Research and Review in CBER.
Good morning, Jonathan Goldsmith. I'm the Acting Associate Director of the Rare Diseases Program in the Office of New Drugs in the Center for Drugs. And I'm very glad to see some old friends.
I'm Menfo Imoisili. I'm a medical officer in the Office of Orphan Products Development. And I'm here to represent my office. And the person who was supposed to be here for us today is not here, so I'm representing him.
Good morning, I'm Nicole Verdun. I'm from the Office of New Drugs in the CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and I'm a medical officer in the Division of Hematology Products.
Good morning, I'm Diane Maloney, and I am the Associate Director for Policy in the Center for Biologics.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Nisha Jain. I'm the Chief of the Clinical Review Branch in the Division of Hematology Clinical Review in the Office of Blood Research and Review.
Thank you. Well, what I'm going to do right now is kind of go over what our agenda for today is going to be like. First, I'm just going to give you a high-level overview, and my colleagues today are going to be giving a few presentations that set the context for why we're here. We're going to have opening remarks, and we're going to hear about the actual initiative that brings us these patient-focused meetings, background on the heritable bleeding disorders, and then I'm going to give you an overview of how the discussion format's going to go. This is a bit different than a lot of public meetings we have. This is going to be more of a conversation between you and the FDA. The two discussion topics that we'll be going over this morning will be disease symptoms and the impact that matter most to you, the patients. And this afternoon, we'll talk about the perspective on current approaches of treating the heritable bleeding disorders. We also will have an opportunity to have open public comment. Now, that's, if you're interested in saying something that's not in the venue of what we're questioning, if you want to go off topic a little bit, I'm going to probably nudge you along and ask you to sign up for the docket. So out at the registration table is a sign-up list. There's room for about 15 people, and that's open to everyone, patients, industry to speak. And you'll have, depending on the number of people that sign up, you'll have somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes to give your comments. But that is a first come, first serve. So when you get an opportunity, if you think there's something else you'd like to say that might be a little outside the scope, or you just want to make sure your voice is heard, please go on outside and sign up for that part. And then we'll have some closing remarks. So it's exciting to us. We're really glad to get started. And we're going to go ahead and let Jeanette start for us.
Thank you, Donna. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're very excited to host this patient-focused drug development meeting on hemophilia A, hemophilia B, von Willebrand disease, and other heritable bleeding disorders. Our team has prepared extensively for this meeting so that patients and caregivers will have the opportunity to share with us your experience with a bleeding disorder, the symptoms that are a part of your daily life, and the impacts of your disease. And we also want to hear your perspectives on current therapies and existing approaches to treating your disease. This is an important conversation, and so we're very happy to see the large turnout. I believe that we have approximately the same number of participants on the webcast as we have here in the room. I do want to acknowledge the patients, your families and caregivers, and those who advocate on your behalf for your willingness to engage in today's conversation. And I do want to recognize the significant participation of healthcare professionals and representatives of the pharmaceutical industry. Your participation today shows your interest in directly hearing patients' perspectives and in listening to what patients have to say. FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety and efficacy of human drugs and biologic products. The agency is also responsible for advancing public health, and we do that by helping to speed innovations to make medicines more effective, safer, and perhaps even more affordable. While FDA does not itself develop new drugs or conduct clinical studies of new drugs, our role is to oversee and facilitate their development. Drug manufacturers and investigators obtain the information from, the authorization from FDA to study new drugs in patients. And once those studies are completed, manufacturers submit applications to FDA to obtain approval for marketing the new drugs. Our intent today is to carefully gather your perspectives on heritable bleeding disorders and on currently available therapies. In sharing your perspectives, we'll hear directly from you, affected patients, your families and caregivers, and your advocates. This input, along with the comments that are submitted to FDA, will strengthen our understanding of bleeding disorders, in particular the burden that these disorders place on patients and their families, and the various ways that patients try to manage their disease, the side effects resulting from existing therapies, the ways in which current therapies do not fully meet patients' needs, and from the patient's perspective, how these therapies could be improved. FDA will carefully consider your input when advising manufacturers on their drug development program for drugs or biologics intended to treat bleeding disorders. And your perspectives are also going to be considered when we assess products for marketing approval, and more specifically in making an assessment of the benefits of a new drug versus its risks. In addition, the perspectives we hear today will be helpful more broadly in the drug development process in helping to identify unmet needs or opportunities for developing new measures of effectiveness in clinical studies. To date, FDA has held over 10 patient-focused drug development meetings on a variety of disorders. And thanks to the participation of patients and caregivers such as yourselves, as well as patient advocates, we have learned a great deal about the burden of disease and the gaps in current therapies. We urge you to participate fully in today's conversation, and we also invite you to submit any additional comments to the FDA docket. I can't overemphasize the critical role of patients and caregivers in today's meeting. This is your meeting. We are here to listen to you, patients, caregivers, and advocates, because you have important information to convey and a very unique view on your life and how it's being altered by your bleeding disorder and the benefits and shortcomings of therapies as they exist today. In closing, I want to thank my colleagues from the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research for their efforts in preparing this meeting. This includes my colleagues from the Office of Blood Research and Review, the Office of Cell, Tissue, and Genetic Therapies, and the Office of Communication, Outreach, and Development. We are also grateful to our colleagues in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research for their very generous assistance in preparing for this meeting. And so, in closing, I want to wish you a very successful and productive meeting. And I will return the microphone to Donna. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next, Teresa's going to talk to us next.
Oh, all right. Good morning. I'm Theresa Mullen, and I direct the Office of Strategic Programs in the Center for Drugs. And my office has been sort of coordinating this patient-focused drug development initiative overall. And this meeting is one, as you were hearing from my CBER colleagues, this is one in a number of meetings. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to try to put a little context around this. And hopefully I won't be too repetitious. I realize some of the things I'm going to say, Jeanette has already said, so hopefully that's okay. It won't be. But to begin with, we are trying, and this effort is part of our broader effort in FDA to more systematically gather patients' perspective on their disease and on the treatments that are currently available. We know that they have a very unique and critical perspective because the patient's the one who is suffering both the risks of any therapy and the benefits and knows what it's like to have the disease. So their views on how it feels to have the disease and what's working and not working about available treatments is obviously uniquely important in understanding that if we're going to be evaluating these treatments and looking at it in the context of things already on the market. And so we see that input not only helping us get better insight to help inform drug development and advise sponsors who are developing new drugs, but even in reviewing drugs post-market once they're on the market. The perspective of patients, the severity of a condition, and the degree of unmet medical need are very much form what we call the clinical context in which we evaluate the risk versus benefit. The more severe a condition, for example, the more severe it is for the patients, the more perhaps life-threatening, the more willing patients often are to accept risks in exchange for some real benefit. And so we need to be very cognizant of that. That's really what needs to be informing our judgment of risk-benefit. So that's why we think your perspective is quite necessary for us to really do a good job at doing pre-market and post-market oversight of drugs. And so this patient-focused drug development initiative is one that we're doing as part of the prescription drug user fee reauthorization in 2012. We got some additional funds to help us to support and run these meetings, and we agreed to conduct at least 20 meetings over the course of 5 years. We're probably on track to do more than that. But in 20 different disease areas, the Center for Drugs is committed to do at least 17 meetings. CBER is committed to do at least 3 such meetings in the areas that we oversee, the portfolio of diseases and products that we oversee. And these meetings give us that sort of systematic approach to trying to collect this information. We had a public meeting and a process in September of 2012 on through October of 2012 to see what diseases we should consider. We put out some criteria. We received about 4,500 comments and from the public about what diseases. We narrowed that down to a set in the first 3 years of 16 diseases, and that I'll show you an overview of in a second. And they were now going through the process of identifying diseases for the last 2 years, 2016 and 17, of this 5-year reauthorization. So here you see the diseases that we're covering in the first 3 years, and in bolded in blue here we have today's meeting: Hemophilia A, B, von Willebrand disease, and the other heritable bleeding disorders. And what you see over on the right is the remaining that we'll try to be accomplishing within the next year, basically. Each of these meetings is tailored a little bit, but it's also consistent in terms of the questions we're asking. So there's some continuity across these meetings. Despite the fact that disease areas are different, we still ask some similar questions about what it feels like to live day to day with the disease. What are the biggest impacts that the disease has on the patient's life and on their family, and so on, and then what their perspective is on what they're doing to treat the disease. But we also try to tailor these meetings, and the review divisions who are involved in reviewing the products may have specific questions or concerns. There may be questions about trials, people participating in trials, the kind of endpoints that matter to patients, and obviously having you here provides a unique opportunity to ask you, what do you think? Get your opinion about these things, and the review divisions find that to be very helpful. So we have a combination of tailoring and then having some consistency across this as well. The outreach that patient advocacy groups and patient groups help us with prior to these meetings is critical. We find that the more participation that we get, the richer the meeting, the more informative. And so it's wonderful, as Janae was saying, to have the turnout today of people who were here in the room and also those who are able to participate on the web. And finally, what do we do with this information? Well, the most immediate product is a report that we call the Voice of the Patient report. And in that report, we try to very faithfully capture exactly the way patients tell us what they think and what they tell us and the way they say it in that report, both the face-to-face, what we hear in the room, and also what is provided by patients in the docket and what we hear over the webcast. All of this input is brought into those reports, and they serve as a very valuable reference tool for the review division reviewers in any subsequent applications or information questions they have in the disease area that we focused on in the meeting. It also, we think, will help spur further development, interest in patient-reported outcome measures, and maybe subsequent instrumentation that can further enrich clinical trials by bringing in more systematic collection of that information about how the patient is feeling and functioning and the impact on their life. In case a new treatment has particular benefit in that area, we'd like to actually capture that information and have that be part of the application and the dossier of what we have. And so with that, I'll turn it over. You're going to hear now about the background of this disease. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Thank you again for your time and participation. Today I will be providing some background on heritable bleeding disorders. Some of this information may not be new to you, but given that There are a number of different disorders represented here today. I will be highlighting the various heritable bleeding disorders. I'll start with an overview of how the body normally stops or prevents bleeding. Then I'll go into a background of the different disorders and talk about their symptoms and a little bit about treatment. How a bleed stops normally involves the interactions between platelets and proteins in the blood called clotting factors. Platelets stick together and form a plug at the site of the injured blood vessel. Clotting factors then interact with platelets to form a glue or fibrin clot. This interaction holds the platelets in place and allows healing to occur at the site of injury while preventing blood from escaping the blood vessel. Heritable bleeding disorders occur when normal clotting goes awry. These disorders are a group that range from mild to life-threatening conditions and may be present lifelong. The underlying reasons that prevent normal clotting include problems with the platelet plug, such as in von Willebrand's disease, defects in the fibrin clot because of low levels of clotting factors, such as in low factor 8 or 9 in hemophilia, as well as other factor deficiencies. Excessive breakdown of clot or fibrinolysis can also be an underlying reason, and this is seen in alpha-2 antiplasmin deficiency. Finally, fragile blood vessels can also lead to bleeding, as seen in hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. Now let's move on to some of the more common disorders. Von Willebrand disease is the most common inherited bleeding disorder, affecting 1 in 100 people. However, more than 65% of these patients have no symptoms or have mild symptoms. It occurs equally in men and women and is due to reduced or abnormal production of von Willebrand factor, which leads to problems in the platelet plug. Although bleeding may vary in severity, there are some patients with very severe disease. The second most common inherited bleeding disorder is hemophilia A, with 1 in 5,000 male births affected. Almost all patients are male because of its X-linked inheritance pattern. Hemophilia A is due to low levels of factor VIII in the blood, which lead to abnormal clot formation. The lower the factor VIII level in the blood, the more severe the bleeding symptoms. Hemophilia B is not as common as hemophilia A, but it does have a similar X-linked inheritance pattern, with almost all patients being male. Hemophilia B is also known as Christmas disease and affects 1 in 30,000 male births. Severe bleeding occurs due to low levels of factor IX in the blood. Now let's talk a little about the rare bleeding disorders. Platelet disorders occur rarely in the general population, with 1 in 1 million people being affected, such as in Glanzmann's thrombocythemia, Bernard-Soulier syndrome, and even more rare in gray platelet syndrome. Platelet disorders result either from not making enough platelets or from platelets not working properly. Although these patients have long bleeding times, they can also range from mild to severe disease. Other examples of rare disorders include some that can be seen in a very limited number of families, such as factor I deficiency or afibrinogenemia, where over 200 cases have been reported. Other factor deficiencies, such as factor V, 7, 10, and 11 are also rare. So what are the signs and symptoms of heritable bleeding disorders? The symptoms are largely due to bleeding that may vary in severity, such as bleeding after circumcision or after having vaccinations, bruising or collection of blood in the muscles and soft tissues, nosebleeds that are frequent or hard to stop, spontaneous bleeding that occur without any obvious cause, as well as bleeding following trauma or surgery. Bleeding can also be seen in the joints, and this can cause swelling, pain, or tightness, and often affects the knees, the elbows, and ankles. Heavy and frequent menstrual bleeding, as well as heavy bleeding after childbirth, also occurs. One of the most serious symptoms is head bleeds, or bleeding into the brain, and this can occur even after a simple bump to the head and requires emergency treatment. All these symptoms are important to patients, and FDA recognized the need to explore them further so that they can be better accounted for in the drug development and review process. There are multiple approaches to treatment. Avoidance of medications that can aggravate bleeding is important. Current therapies depend on the type of bleeding and the severity of bleeds, and may include platelet transfusions, fresh frozen plasma, cryoprecipitate, specific factor concentrates such as factor VIII or factor IX, desmopressin, as well as supportive treatments such as hormone replacement therapies, pain medications, and clot stabilizing medications. In terms of new treatments, gene therapy is being studied as a possible treatment for hemophilia. There can be complications to treatment. One of the most serious complications is inhibitor development to factor concentrates. Inhibitors are antibodies that attack the clotting factor, causing bleeds to be more severe and making treatments less effective. Other serious complications include severe allergic reactions. Complications due to frequent intravenous infusions can also be seen and may lead to scarring of veins, which can lead to the requirement of implanted catheter devices, which have their own risks, as well as the risks of infections. We are here today to listen to you. We encourage you to take this opportunity to provide FDA greater insight into your bleeding disorder. Thank you.
Well, before I get started on my overview of the discussion format, it occurred to me as I was walking over to the web table and looking at my colleagues that we do have some FDA colleagues that are assisting us, that are sitting at the tables, and we have a couple of medical officers sitting at the web to help answer questions. So we have Lisa and Simone and Kiteg. And so let's go ahead and get started a little bit. Okay, first an overview. Topic 1, we're going to really ask our panelists, and then the question we're going to pose is, what are the effects of your bleeding disorder? And we're going to ask that you concentrate on those symptoms that you experience because of your conditions, and which of the 1 to 3 symptoms have the most impact on your life. And then we want you to concentrate on what are the specific activities that are important to you, but you cannot do it all or as well as you would like. How has your condition and its symptoms changed over time, and what are your worries about your condition? In the afternoon, we'll tackle the question of what about current approaches to the treatment. So what are you currently doing to treat your condition or its symptoms? And when we talk about that, we want you to also include how well are these treatments working for you? What are the significant advantages and disadvantages you found? What are the complications? How do they affect your daily life and how you go about your business of living? Has your treatment changed? Why? What aspects of your condition are not improved? And then if you could also kind of think about what is an ideal treatment. If you could wave a wand and there's something perfect, what would you look for in an ideal treatment? And if you had finally we'll talk about if you had the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, studying experimental treatments, what would you consider? What would you have to think about in order to decide whether or not you were going to participate? So right now, as I continue going, I'm going to ask my first set of panelists if they could start making their way up here to the table. We're going to ask them to give you a little bit of background on question one, and we're asking them to limit their stories and their experiences to 5 minutes of sharing. I recognize that these questions and this time limit is a constraint that puts you in a box and that it seems almost impossible. However, we do have a limited time today to kind of think about these questions. So what we really are going to do is try to focus on the questions that FDA can really think about and build on. Now, if there's something that you really feel like you need to say and you don't have time, then I do want to again encourage you to sign up for the public comment period, or you'll be able to list your comments to the public docket. Once we hear from our patients, we're going to spread these questions out, and I'm going to ask you your opinions and your experiences. And when we do this, I'm going to ask you to state your name, and if you could, tell us what your disease is that you're talking about. Now, on the other side is we are going to have some polling questions. So for our guests that are sitting at the table, there are these little clickers. They are not to order your lunch or to fling across the room to get my attention, although that's usually pretty effective. But when we have the polling questions come up, we'll test them out and you'll get to vote on some questions. So as a colleague of mine says, it'll be very game showy and you'll get to pick your best answer. So we're looking for it. People participating on the web, you too will have an opportunity. The polling questions will come up on the screen, and you might have to scroll down if you don't see the answers that I'm mentioning, but it's all there for you. What we will be doing is all comments, people on the web, you'll also see little boxes where you can make comments. We'll actually incorporate your comments in our summary report. So. Now that leads us to sending us your comment. If you don't have time, if we don't get to you today, it's not because we didn't want to. Your experience is very important to us. We just have limited time. So you can send us your comments. If you have a friend that couldn't make it, they can send us their comments. If you're driving home on the Beltway and the sun's no longer in your eyes and you're thinking, I wish I said that, you can send it to the public docket. On the pages that you're given a handout of our slides today. You'll see that there's the website, which is www.regulations.gov. At the top corner, there's a little button you're going to click that says Comment Now. It doesn't come with the music I would like. I would like it to have a drum roll, Comment Now. But that's your option to do, and we will also take those comments into consideration and put them in our summary report. Again, now let's talk about the ground rules for discussions. We encourage patients, caregivers, and advocates to contribute to the dialogue. We really want to hear what you have to say. FDA is here, but we've got our listening ears on, and we will ask you some questions, clarifying, finding out more about what your thinking is, but we're really not going to be able to answer very many, if any, of your questions. So again, if there's a question that you have come up that we're unable to answer, you could put it, we encourage you to put it to the docket, and we might not be able to respond to you, but at least we'll know what your questions are, and it'll help us inform how we go about our business. The discussion is going to focus on symptoms and treatments. Like I said earlier, There's a lot of other things that we could talk about. However, this is what our focus is today. And so if we happen to get a little bit off topic, you'll see me kind of nudge you along to back into what the purpose of the questions are. The views today are personal opinions, and we ask that you respect everyone's opinion. It might not be how you see a situation, but it's their reality. So we'll respect everyone's opinion and we'll really listen. And then we want you to tell us how we're doing. How did this meeting go? Did it give you what you needed? At the end of the day, there's going to be an evaluation survey, and we really, really encourage you to fill that out. I can speak as someone who works in training. We really look at those and make changes on how we do things based on your input. So please do let us know how we're doing. Again, last time I'm going to mention this piece. Well, maybe after lunch if we're not filled. We do have an open public comment period at the end of the day. This is the time where everyone gets an opportunity to speak. Prior to that, during the discussion period, we're really only going to be talking to our patients, our patient advocates, our family members. But the open public comment time is when everyone in the room is free to come and speak to us. Again, if you could sign up out at the registration table. It is first come, first serve. I think we have about 15 slots open, and depending on how many people are going to talk really will depend on how long you'll have to speak. So with that, if we could, everyone, if you could grab your clickers. Oh, this is a demographic slide. Really, this is all very anonymous. We're not going to hold you to anything. It's not a scientific survey. We're just looking for some demographics to help us know who's in the room with us today. And again, if I could get this morning's panelists, first panelists, Sanja, Daniel, Mark, and Amanda to come on up while we're doing these. Up. I need my clicker. Yeah, you guys can take your clickers. Here, let me give you some. Oh, we're going to get your clickers there. Great. Okay, so our first question is where you live. Do you live inside our lovely area of the metropolitan DC area? The beautiful suburbs and our wonderful Beltway? If you live outside of our area and think, why the heck do I have to go through this traffic to get here, or are you international? I did want to know. There we go. This is why I'm not really allowed to have the clicker usually. So, wow, 69% of you are outside of our area. How was that drive for you today? Was it great? What was it like on the web?
About 85% outside the area.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next question is, what's the following best describes you? Do you have a heritable bleeding disorder? Are you a family member or caretaker of someone with a heritable bleeding disorder? Or do you work for a patient or advocacy organization? Okay. The fun part on this thing is you get to see people voting, so that's what the green things are. And about 42% of you are actually have a heritable bleeding disorder, with 30% of you family members. So welcome. We're so glad that you're here. What was the percentage on the web?
About half are advocates, and the other half are equally split between patients and caregivers.
Great, thank you. I think two of us are playing with the computer. I'm going to put the clicker down. It'll make it much more effective. I think we have to go back one. There, great. So if you don't see green and you've clicked once, try clicking one more time. Have you or your loved one been diagnosed with any of the following heritable bleeding disorders? Von Willebrand disease, Hemophilia A, C is Hemophilia B, other factor deficiencies, platelet dysfunction. Okay, next slide. Great, thanks. Oh, okay. Overwhelming in the room, affected by Hemophilia A.
And on the web, it's the same distribution.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, what is your or your loved one's age? If you're a patient caregiver, if you could be talking about the patient that you're taking care of. A is 0 to 12, 13 to 16, 17 to 49. You can see in the pediatric ages, we really kind of broke them down. 65 or older. Okay, can we have the results? Wow. It's quite a jump from the 0 to 12 to 17 to 49.
And on the web is very similar, although there's slightly more in the 50 to 65 category.
Okay, we do have 16 and 19% in the older. Well, excellent. We're glad to have everybody here. Let's go to the next question. Okay, this is an easy one. You're not going to get much time on this. And slow. Okay, what do we have there? So 94. It's kind of overwhelming there, and 94% of us are male. What on the web?
70% male and 30% female.
Great, thank you. So this question really gets to how severe has your bleeding disorder been in the last year, in that it had you go to the hospital. So how often have you or your loved one had to go to the hospital or emergency room because of the bleeding disorder? Either none in the past year, 1 to 2 times, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, or more than 10 times. Well, we're split in the room between 1 to 2 times and none, with 3% of you more than 10 times, so can't even imagine what that must be like. How is it on the web?
On the web, we have 44% none, 22 1 to 2, 16 3 to 5, and 16 6 to 10.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that background. That really gives us some information that frames our discussion. I wanted to make sure I turned off that so we didn't hear that buzzing that drives people crazy. So the first question that our panelists are going to speak about are the disease symptoms and the impacts that matter most to them as patients. So we're going to ask Sanja. Oh yes, I'm sorry. Touch the red button and it'll light up for us.
Hello. My name is Sanja Wilkes and I am from Englewood, Colorado. I have mild hemophilia, but today I want to tell you about my 11-year-old son, Thomas. Thomas has severe hemophilia A, and he has been fighting an inhibitor since he was about 7 months old. He also has asthma and an acquired immune deficiency and needs IVIG treatments every 4 weeks. While his bleeding episodes have been numerous and frightening, the most challenging impacts for him and my entire family are situations that influence his quality of life beyond just his clinical conditions. Venous access is our #1 concern. Because he infuses factor concentrate daily for his immune tolerance, good venous access is paramount. When he bleeds and needs multiple infusions per day, the need for access is even more critical. As an infant, he had a Broviac catheter. Eventually, the Broviac succumbed to the wear and tear of repeated use. We made the decision to implant a portacath. Little did we know that it would be the first of 5 ports to date, along with multiple PICC lines. Thomas's veins are hard to stick on a regular basis, and he has a repeated history of compartment syndromes after peripheral infusions by medical professionals. It is uncertain if he will require another port or even if his body will hold up to another insertion, not to mention the bleeding and infection risk involved with the surgical placement. It's a terrifying place to live in, to have the very medication that can save his life in your hands and not know if you're going to be able to infuse it because of venous access issues. Chronic and acute pain management has also been a significant challenge for Thomas. Repeated joint bleeds into his left ankle have miraculously caused little visible damage, but he consistently complains of soreness there and in other areas of his body. He recently said to me as we were standing in the grocery store, "Mommy, my body is like that of an old man's. I'm just sore all the time." He's 11. He does not tolerate most opioids or narcotics, and the side effects often make him harder to manage medically. In 2013, we tried a combination of a transdermal opioid patch and an anti-nausea drug during a particularly nasty shoulder bleed. Despite my insistence for weaning, Thomas continued on these patches for 3 months, 2 months past the worst of the acute pain. He became dependent on the patches. The suffering my then 10-year-old son had to go through during the withdrawals for such powerful yet mildly effective drugs was something I would never wish on my worst enemy. Like most boys, Thomas has a competitive spirit, but because of his physical limitations, most sports are off limits. He started swim lessons at an early age, and in the summer of 2011, swam with a neighborhood swim team. He excelled and even qualified for the All-Stars meet. We continued with a year-round team, but he spent much of 2011 through 2013 sidelined as he battled port infections and significant bleeds in his iliopsoas and quad muscles. Last summer, he returned to the pool, but found he didn't have the stamina or speed that he had once had. Despite sadness about not being able to do what he loves on the level that he'd like to participate at, he continued to have fun with his peers. Thomas misses an average of 20 school days per year. During the past year, he missed an entire trimester due to the shoulder bleed and the resulting dependency on pain medications. Our school district worked with us to provide a homebound teacher, but she was only with him for 2 hours a day, and he soon fell behind. Even after he had recovered enough to attend school, he had to remain home 1 day a week for us to retain eligibility for the homebound teacher. Through sheer determination, Thomas was able to move on to the 6th grade this year. His father and I, distraught over him unable to be able to attend school, bought at our own expense a robot that travels from class to class, enabling him to replicate himself from a distant location so that he can interact with his peers and teachers as if he was physically present at school. Hemophilia hasn't gotten easier over time for us. The bleeds, pain, and line infections still happen despite all our preventative efforts. As a family, we've just become more skilled in coping. We've made multiple attempts at immune suppression therapy to eradicate his inhibitor, but simply cannot sustain a 0 Bethesda unit. From the time Thomas was born, we've tried to prevent bleeding management to minimize joint damage. I didn't want Thomas reliant on a wheelchair. Limited mobility has become less of a worry, though, as I see Thomas adapt when he needs to. But the root cause of that limited mobility, whether or not his factor concentrate will work and address a bleed to minimize that damage, is what worries me the most. Bleeding management of an inhibitor patient is staggering. Currently, we only have 2 products to choose from to control bleeding, and only 1 product approved for prophylaxis. Every time a bleed happens, I never know, and I hold my breath to see if it's going to work and if the bleed is going to stop. It's scary, and I never know if it's going to take 1 treatment or multiple infusions over the course of a week or weeks. I worry that my child might literally lose life or limb, and I only have a limited range of medical interventions to help him. There's worried over the affordability of the drugs available to him. There's worried over the access to his medical team and if my insurance company will allow me to utilize their expertise. There's worry over his mental and emotional condition. There's enough worry to fill an ocean, but I'll meet that worry with advocacy and empowerment so that my child can live his best life despite any limitations. Thank you for the opportunity to share our experiences today.
Oh, thank you so much. Dan? If you could hit your red button. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dan Bond. I'm a 60-year-old engineer with severe hemophilia B. I've spent my career making things go faster, so I hope this is brief. I've had a total of 6 joint replacements, both knees, both elbows, 1 ankle, and 1 hip. Technically, only 5 were due to bleeding. The hip replacement was after a fall downstairs going to breakfast at an NHF lobbying event here in DC. A few years ago. I blame the smell of the bacon. I've also had a total of 5 revisions in my replaced elbows. Joint replacements are like getting a new kitchen. Revisions are like unclogging a sink. Both are good to do, but one is far more rewarding. The surgery cut through the muscles and left me with very little strength in my triceps, making it exceptionally difficult for me to turn wrenches. In addition to the limited strength of There's only a 1/8 inch diameter pin connecting the 2 parts of my elbows. The first elbow repair surgery was to replace that pin after I bent it opening a jar. I have to be very careful using what little strength I have. My first job in high school was as a deckhand on a Caribbean charter sailboat that was spending the off-season in Galveston. It seemed like a great life. I dreamed of living on a boat sailing around the world. Never mind the idea of infusing fresh frozen plasma in the middle of the Atlantic. It seemed like a good idea to a 19-year-old. As my ankles degraded with joint disease, it became clear that I couldn't walk on a pitching deck. I haven't sailed in over 40 years. In college, I discovered bicycle racing. I trained in Houston with national championship riders, serving mostly as traffic for them to pass. After my elbow replacements, it became too difficult and dangerous for me to ride and expose the fragile implants to a crash. I haven't ridden a bike in over 20 years. As an engineer, I enjoy building things. It's grown increasingly difficult for me to do that. It's frustrating to know that I could unstick a bolt and not hurt myself if I could just get a longer wrench to fit. Working under a car is out because I can't reach overhead. With my replaced knees, kneeling is out. Pretty much all I have left is telling other people what to do. That's fun in its own right, but not as satisfying as doing it myself. 60 years is a long time with this disease. There was a history of hemophilia in my family, so there was a relative in the delivery room ready to give me a direct transfusion. Fortunately, it wasn't needed. I've seen treatment progress from that to dried plasma, to fractionated plasma, to plasma concentrates, to recombinant clotting factor, to long-lasting factors. In 2002, I was subject for a gene therapy trial. With each leap, the condition became easier to manage. But of all of these advances, the most life-changing was going from being hospitalized for treatment to self-infusion. I began self-infusions with fresh frozen plasma in 1975. Factor concentrates, 3,000 IU vials, easy reconstitution are all lovely improvements, but they pale next to the change from hospital-based administration to self-infusion. The freedom allowed by self-infusion made pretty much everything I've done possible. It gave me the ability to travel, to get an education, and to do what I enjoy. Like 10,000 of the 20,000 people with hemophilia who were alive in the 80s, I contracted HIV as a result of infusing plasma concentrates contaminated with the virus. Thousands of them died, but thanks to early and consistent treatment and no small amount of luck, my HIV is undetectable. Hepatitis C now kills more people with hemophilia than HIV now, but last year I became one of the lucky few who spontaneously cleared the hepatitis C. With my diseases under control, my biggest worry is about the social contract that keeps me alive. In my 60 years, I've cost the citizens of this country well over $20 million in inflation-adjusted dollars. My insurance this year has paid out $191,000, and this was a year with no unusual procedures or surgeries. And so when I say I owe a great debt, it's not just a metaphor. Hopefully my experience is worth some fraction of that. I'm also trying to pay it back by volunteering for phase 1 and phase 2 trials, including the gene therapy trial, which has recently led to some real successes. I'm also on product advisory boards, scientific advisory boards, as well as the board of my local chapter. We often say that bleeding disorders community is like a big family. And like any parent, I'm just trying to make things a little better for the next generation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dan, so much. Mark?
So, good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and present today. I want to share with you a little bit about my life and what it means to me to be normal in terms of what I would aspire to. Like Dan, I was born at a time when treatment did not exist. My early treatment was fresh frozen plasma and whole blood. I live with severe hemophilia today, as well as all the comorbidities that came over the course of time. The promise of better treatment and a better life that arose from the clotting factor concentrates that were developed in the 1960s did lead to my acquiring all of the hepatitis A, B, and C, which fortunately within the last year I cleared because of the advances of the new drugs. But I also, over the course of time, have had 9 joint surgeries. I've had both of my knees replaced, both of my ankle fused, surgery on my elbows, and facing the prospect of a shoulder replacement because of the chronic joint disease. And so though enormous progress has been made, it hasn't been without its challenges, and life is certainly far from normal for me today. 3 years ago, as an adult, I started secondary prophylaxis, which for me was life-changing, but my annual factor bill exceeds $600,000 a year for my medication costs, because I'm one of those unfortunate individuals who happens to have a shorter than typical half-life, and to control the residual bleeding and swelling that occurs, I require frequent infusions and infuse every other day. So as we think about what is normal, I very much appreciate this focus and shift to thinking about what is important to the patient and the patient-centric approach. Historically, when we thought about normal, and we've talked about normal, for me as a child, normal was achieving a normal lifespan, normal adulthood. As a child, I was expected to live into my early 30s. And I think for many of us, we're still stuck in a definition of normal is surviving a normal life that everybody else has. And to me, normal is so much more than just a life expectancy. My goal isn't to survive, but my goal is to actually have a high quality of life. And as we think about the dimensions that mean a normal quality of life, it is going to be very much individualized. We've really moved from that generation of treating the disease to the opportunity now to treat the individual, and thinking about what are those life goals, those aspirations, and what are the things that the individual wants. So for me, the new criteria should be more than lifespan. It should be more than factor levels in terms of treating to a clinical number. But it really should be working with the patients to think about, and the individuals and the families to think about what's required for me as an individual to have a normal work and career life. Throughout my life, I was forced to make a number of career decisions from what I wanted to do to what I was able to do because of my bleeding disorder. As a young man and as a law student, I was very interested in going into the Foreign Service. My hemophilia was an exclusion because I couldn't accept a posting anywhere around the world because I lived with a rare genetic disease and I needed to have treatment. I was forced to make decisions on where I was going to locate and have my career because I knew with the complications, not only the hemophilia, but the HIV and the viral infections, that I needed to be near a major medical center. I grew up in rural Kansas. I grew up 4 hours from my treatment center and was forced to spend a lot of time in a car in a very painful situation waiting to get to the nearest access for treatment. I know that exists for many of my friends and colleagues around the world today. I think of a normal family and a normal social life. For me, a normal family life seems somewhat inconceivable because of the prospect of HIV and the ability to plan ahead. So those opportunities, although I have a wonderful life now, certainly were challenging, and I expect at a different level the social and family life issues face young children today. I think of normal activity in sport, very similar to Dan. Within the last 20 years, I gave up riding a bike. It was just too painful. It was too difficult. And even recently, one of my favorite activities, swimming, has proved very problematic because of the problems in my shoulder. I do maintain a relatively active life, but the sports and the activities in which I can engage, despite being on prophylaxis, are still limited because of my disease. So within the current treatment paradigm, I would say that we really haven't yet achieved normal. And my desire for normal is to lead a comparable life to someone who is not affected with a bleeding disorder. I think to realize that goal, I do think that we need to shift our clinical focus and to build the outcomes around outcomes that are important to patients, not just relevant clinical endpoints, so that I don't have to make decisions about my life goals related to the disease, but that I know that the drugs are being developed to help me make decisions about my life goals that are actually important to me as an individual. While it's important to me not to bleed and to have no bleeds in life, an annual bleed rate of 0 is really not much more than a numeric value if it doesn't mean that I can have the quality of life. So I would encourage you to begin to think about and use your influence as the FDA to help bring that needed change, to bring those qualitative aspects of what normal means to patients and not necessarily treating to a lab value or chasing a numeric value of 0 bleeds. If we have that holistic approach, and it may be challenging, I think we will all be better off. Thank you.
Thank you. Amanda?
Hello, my name is Amanda Heisey. I'm from Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, and I'm here today. Hemophilia has been a part of my life since I was born. My older brother had severe hemophilia A with an inhibitor. He contracted HIV and hepatitis from blood products in the 1980s, and he suffered from chronic joint pain and joint damage. My 4-year-old son now suffers from the same diagnosis. He has severe hemophilia A with an inhibitor. We have faced many challenges over the years. One of the most difficult symptoms to deal with is the joint pain during bleeding episodes. When my 4-year-old son has bleeding into his knees or ankles, he is unable to walk. Sorry. It is always a challenge to watch. I'm sorry. I don't think I could read this. Sorry. It's okay. It's okay. Take your time. When my 4-year-old son has bleeding into his knees or ankles, he is unable to walk. It is always a challenge to watch your young son in pain. There is little pain medications available that we feel comfortable giving him because we do not feel comfortable giving him narcotics. During and after bleeding episodes, we are concerned with the damage into his joints. The acute bleed is difficult to manage, however, the chronic joint damage is always a concern. Every bleed puts him at risk for chronic joint damage. We are concerned for his future. We do not want him to experience arthritis. I have seen this with my brother who had chronic joint damage. My son is unable to participate in many physical activities due to hemophilia. He is unable to participate in sports to the risk of injury. Although he is young and is not ready for many sports, this is difficult because he has an older brother who does not have hemophilia. His older brother plays hockey and baseball. Many times he says he will play hockey when he is older. This is an issue we struggle with as parents because it is difficult to explain to a young boy why he cannot play a sport. During bleeding episodes, he is placed on what the physician calls couch rest. This is exactly what it sounds like. He sits on the couch and rests. He cannot participate in any activities during his bleeds. He rests on the couch and watches TV. We even have to carry him to the bathroom. During these events, we usually have to cancel any family activities that were previously planned. The bleeds often lead to multiple treatments. Because of the multiple treatments, I, myself, often have to miss work as I am his primary caregiver. One activity that we have always counted on for Peyton was swimming. He has not always been able to participate due to his port. He has an implanted port for his daily treatments. But because of the port, he is at risk for an infection. Infection could lead to an additional surgery, which would be risky. We do what we can to protect him from infection.
He is not allowed to swim in bodies of water such as ponds or oceans due to the risk of bacterial infection. Our children ask to go to the beach, and we avoid it to avoid the risk of infection. He is also not supposed to swim in a public pool within 24 hours of accessing his port. This poses a problem when we access him daily. Our son has experienced changes with hemophilia over the past 4 years. Our son was diagnosed with hemophilia 1 week after he was born. When he was 10 months old, he was diagnosed with an inhibitor. At that moment, it was like he was diagnosed with a new disease. We would have to take bypassing agent instead of the factor VIII he needed. We struggled with his inhibitor increasing until he was 18 months old. At that time, he started on a daily factor treatment of factor VIII to attempt to tolerize the inhibitor. He has been on that treatment for over 3 years and has not tolerized it this time. There are periods of time when the factor VIII seems to help and work well, during which time he has no bleeding episodes. However, since March 2014, he has experienced many bleeds into his knee joints and recently had an ankle bleed. At those times, he has increased pain and is unable to walk. Our biggest concern currently is his inhibitor status. I am concerned that the inhibitor will not completely go away and that we will continue daily treatments. I am concerned because of the fluctuation of the inhibitor and the ability for the factor VIII to be effective. If the inhibitor increases again, he will be at risk for more bleeds, which will eventually lead to joint damage.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say I probably should have went first because when they started talking, I started thinking of all the things he wasn't going to be able to deal with.
Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your story and your son's story. I think that everyone up here on our panel deserves a round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing. Which leads us now usually I sing when a microphone comes on, so I'm not going to I was forbidden to do that, so come back at lunchtime and I probably will. How many of you heard your stories in any of these, by a show of hands, heard your stories? Let's hear one or two of those. Let's try to take a conversation from someone who'd like to.
Good morning. My name is Carlita Gates, and all of us have so many similar stories. I am a carrier. My father, Roosevelt Green, had severe hemophilia A. He passed away in 1997 from hemophilia HIV that he contracted from a blood product. I'm the oldest of 3 girls in my family. We're all carriers. We all have 2 sons apiece, and I also have 2 daughters. They're all severe hemophilia A. All the stories are the same. What has impacted our family the most is, well, as far as an improvement, my father had all the joint diseases, went through cryoprecipitate, treating at the hospital, 5 hours away from the hospital. But with my generation, my sons, they do have the privilege of treating at home on prophylaxis. My oldest son, who's 25 years old, does have a bit of joint issues because that was before the days they started doing prophylactic treatment. But my 19-year-old has no joint issues. He's able to treat prophylaxis. He has access. And what's most important is blood safety, making sure the blood supply remains safe so that the treatments remain safe. That's the most important to me. My son, he was 6 years old when my father passed, and he knew that he had hemophilia. He knew he had HIV. But he says, well, Mommy, am I going to die from hemophilia? I says, no, baby. Hemophilia didn't kill your father, your grandfather. It was the HIV. You're going to live a much better life because their treatments are getting better. And later on, as he got older, he said, Mommy, you were right. He's able to do everything most of his peers, except for basketball, but that got better as he got older. We steered him into golf and swimming. So that's changed over time, but what worries me the most, I appreciate you guys having this because you need to hear it from our perspectives. We're not the ones that are going to develop the future treatments, but we're the ones that are going to have to, deal with the future treatments, what that brings. And my son told me to send this message. He wants to take a pill. He does not want to infuse intravenously. develop a pill that he could maybe take once a week. Like if you have a headache, you take a ibuprofen or aspirin or whatever. Well, he doesn't take aspirin, but something simple that would make it even better for their quality of life. I could go on, and it would take me 8 hours nonstop talking to tell you some of the stories and issues that we've gone through, but I think you're going to get a pretty good snippet of it. But I thank you for having this meeting. It means a lot to our community.
Well, thank you very much for that. We will be talking more about treatment this afternoon, so thank you. Did anyone have an experience that's different than what we heard? Okay. Did you want to? Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeanette, and I have von Willebrand's disease, and my 3 teenagers do. And although there's clearly many similarities between the different bleeding disorders in our community, I think the experience of having VWD definitely has some differences between the experience of hemophilia, and the challenges can be a little bit different. I think part of it comes in having knowledge of our disease. I think that's something that impacts myself and my family a lot, in terms of the journey we've taken personally over the years in getting more informed and understanding our disease state and understanding our treatment possibilities and how it affects our life. And when you talk about von Willebrand's disease, I think there's always an issue kind of validation sometimes. And when I look at those numbers that you put up in the beginning about how many are symptomatic, I question that. Because I think at the times my family's gone to the ER, we've been infused, we've had these events, and it's never documented on our records. And so also thinking about the number of people in my extended family who clearly have bleeding symptoms who have not been diagnosed. So I just think there's, we've had internal bleeds spontaneously, we've had muscle bleeds, joint bleeds, menorrhagia has been a huge impact on my life, and now I have 2 teenage daughters who are facing the same issues, and better treatment options, but still it's years of struggle and trying to find what works.
Well, thank you for that. Christopher?
I wanted to comment, Mark, I'm glad you commented on the quality of life. I think more emphasis needs to be put on quality of life outcomes. Sometimes you might look at the majority of the community and everybody's doing great, but there are those folks that fall through the cracks and have issues with their joints that choose them to be able to attain that quality of life. Maybe you have a desire to ride a bike through Central Park or something, you can't do that. And I was glad to see Sonia say that she had hemophilia. And I have a 3-year-old daughter who has a diagnosis of hemophilia B. So I wish maybe the FDA goes back and redoes some pamphlets or publications to try to get rid of that male-only distinction. It's just a pain in the neck when you have to fight with the doctors to make them believe that, yes, this is really legitimate diagnosis. And I'm not a good patient myself when a doctor comes in and asks how long I had hemophilia. So I'm definitely not a good patient when my child is there being treated, and I usually end up getting hauled off by security. So having the FDA put some bona fide information, because maybe my daughter has 2 defective X's, maybe she only has 1, I don't know, but I know she has a diagnosis of hemophilia B. So regardless of the genetics, I go by factor level, factor activity, and it is low enough to make her have hemophilia B.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any comments from the web?
Our web participants basically have shared the same comments that we've heard here in the audience, and that is that they feel that there's a need to redefine what's normal for patients with bleeding disorders, and in particular hemophilia. And they also have commented on the effects of developing an inhibitor later on in treatment, and how that has changed their quality of life.
Okay, thank you. Does the panel have any questions that they'd like to ask at this point? Christopher, does your daughter have any bleeding episodes? I'm sorry.
Yeah, she injured herself at her daycare in a door and had it be treated then, and she busted her gums falling. She fell and bit her lip, so she's been treated a few times.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I mean, I would share that I did not know. We had no family history of hemophilia in our family. So I was 26 years old before I knew that I was a carrier. And that was with Thomas's circumcision. And as soon as the symptoms were starting to be described, I knew. But further testing did prove. And 10 years ago, as a woman, I had to fight for treatment. That tide is turning, but it depends on where you live. On how well that treatment is for women with bleeding disorders. And I do think we need to talk about redefining those definitions because it should be based on your factor activity level, not on your genetics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
I wanted to add to that as well. I am a symptomatic carrier if you looked at my genetic sequencing, but my factor levels go as low as 12%, which makes me qualify as having mild hemophilia. This is my son, and he's moderate to severe hemophilia and on prophylaxis. I have a 45-year-old brother as well that deals with comorbidity issues as well. But I'm heading into another major surgery, as a matter of fact, a week from today, and had a major surgery last December to have a tumor removed. And it was a fight for me to get the physicians to listen and say, you're female, but you're a carrier of hemophilia. You can't be affected by hemophilia. And so it really took a lot of lab work for them to see it and actually believe it because of the fact that they needed that lab level to actually qualify that for their thought process. So it really, taking that labeling off of that and allowing it to be less of a stigma of a full male disorder would definitely be beneficial because I have a daughter, I have two beautiful nieces, my mother as well as a symptomatic carrier. So it is definitely an ongoing battle for the women of the hemophilia community to get the treatment that they need, although it's getting better for us with our sons and our brothers and our fathers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I still see a few hands up, but we're going to take one more question or comment, and then we're going to move on to a couple of other questions that I think will elaborate more.
I'd like to point something out. We keep referencing factor percentages or numbers. They're very important, and they can drive physicians to pay more attention. But, good example, I'm 3%. I have relatively few issues. I have a niece who's a symptomatic carrier. She's 25%. She has many more issues. And so doctors need to take into account not only the percent of your factor, but all of the other clinical manifestations that you have, because each of us is unique as well as having similarities.
Thank you for that. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm sorry. Back to polling. I know it's like our favorite part of the day. Which of the symptoms currently has the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? A, joint damage or pain. B, heavy menstrual bleeding. C, bleeding in the muscles and soft tissues. D, bleeding in the head. E, anxiety and depression. We recognize that you probably want to put your top 2 or 3. Unfortunately, the clickers that I have only let you pick one, so. Okay, so most joint damage, 67% leads. I suspect that these numbers would be just not different, but there'd be a little more skewing if less skewing if we got to do 2 or 3. What about on the web? What do we have there?
On the web, 54% joint damage, 18% heavy menstrual bleeding, 9% bleeding in the muscles, and 27% for anxiety or depression.
Okay. How many times in the past year did you or your loved one experience a bleed? 0 to 4 times, 5 to 11 times, 12 to 23 times, 24 times or more. This is within the last year. Okay. Wow. I can't even imagine that. So 50% of you have 5 to 11 times. What about on the web?
20% for 0 to 4, 40% for 5 to 11, 30% for 12, 27% for 12 to 23, and 9% for more than 24.
Right, and in the room we have 17% at 24 times or more. What we want to do now is discuss in more detail how your bleeding disorders have affected you and your health on an average day. So let's talk about joint pain. I believe that the number was 67% in the room, and on the web, 54. Thank you. So overwhelmingly, can we get the next slide, please? Thank you. And then next one. Well, never mind. Clearly, this is what I want. Let's talk about joint pain specifically and damage. Does anyone want to share with us some specific examples of how joint damage has impacted your life? Thank you.
Sure. I'm Mark Antel, moderate hemophilia A. Ankle problems. I've got this arthropathies. I've had the arthropathies that go with hemophilia, but probably I'm most severely affected in my ankles. And, I don't know that pain is so much the problem as it is incapacity, difficulties in walking. Because pain is something that I think most of us have learned to walk through, and maybe with factors so that we can do it. But the problem is that the joint itself becomes weakened, dysfunctional, and a bad ankle leads to all sorts of problems, both on the side. It leads to problems in the knees and the hips as well. And it also, I think, makes you a little more liable for falls. So I'd say pain is not so much the problem as dysfunction.
Okay.
Quick note is that please hold the microphones close to your mouth when you speak, because that's how the web participants can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
I think pain's an interesting concept in hemophilia. I think we develop a threshold and a tolerance for pain very early in life, and we don't quite appreciate what normal is without pain. And I think as a result, and there's been a lot of community research done, that pain is really vastly under-recognized within the community, and pain is vastly undertreated, and our care systems are really not set up to do it. I mean, I judge pain by, do I want to get up off the couch and walk and refill my coffee cup? Because it hurts too much just to walk across the room. Now, fortunately, much of that has been resolved in my lower extremities, so getting my second cup of coffee isn't what causes me pain, because I can walk now. But reaching for something on the top shelf or doing other kinds of activities, there is a persistent level of pain. So when I get the little smiley faces every time I go into my doctor's office about, what do you think today, it's sort of relative to what? So we don't have a good system to actually even understand what the level of pain is, because it doesn't take into account it's something chronic from the beginning, and we don't know the difference. So it's, but I think the data tells you that it is there, and it's under-recognized, and it's under-treated.
Okay, thank you. Someone has back there. Thank you.
Hi, so I have severe factor VIII deficiency, and I have plenty of joint pain. But the studies that I've been doing on quality of life in the U.S., you give these guys these visual analog scales to try and measure how much, how they're doing, and they almost always put in something like an 8. And you look at them, and they're pretty crippled up, and they can't hardly walk, and you ask them, how the hell are you an 8, And they say, well, I'm better than him, So it's kind of within the community that that's our frame of reference, right? And so I believe that a lot of the data may not may not really be reflective of the amount of pain each of these individuals is seeing.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask that the operator queue up the phone. I think we'll take a call from the phone. But while we're waiting for that,
I'm Glenn Monis. I'm an advocate and I direct the New York City Hemophilia Chapter. Anecdotally, I think that pain as a driver of adherence is a bigger factor than most people normally account for. I think that the connection between, infusing appropriately and relieving pain is more powerful than a lot of people realize and needs to be considered. And in speaking with many families, it's what is it that is the reminder it's time to infuse. It's not I'm gonna sustain long-term damage. Sometimes it is, or that's what I'm supposed to do, or that's what my doctor to do. It's pain.
thank you. Operator, do we have a phone call yet? Maybe not yet. We'll go on.
Hi, Chris Templin here. One of the issues I found in my personal life is I didn't want to complain about the pain because I didn't want to look at it as a wussy or a sissy because I'm a big guy, and how can a big guy like me be in pain? But and I found in the community that I really didn't know where to go to ask because I didn't want to get on the big heavy-duty drugs and be zonked out, and I didn't want to go to the pain clinic to be looked at as a drug seeker or a drug user, because there again I don't look like I'm in pain, because pain is so subjective. Mark alluded to a little bit. We build tolerance to it and a threshold to the pain. And I was very fortunate. My mom is a nurse who worked at the VA hospital, and the VA does a lot of research on pain because they get a lot of people that are hurt and in a lot of pain. And I really had to research to find a good pain medication to take, and I chose methadone as my pain medication. But there, I get that whole stigma that comes with going to the drugstore each month to get that drug. And anytime I ever end up at a doctor's office to write that on the form, that's what I take. And anytime I have to, disclose on any kind of government forms what medicine I take, it's that stigma is, oh my goodness, you're on drugs. I have a commercial driver's license, so that's actually a disqualification for me to be able to drive because I'm on methadone, but I drive anyway. Don't tell the DOT. But it's just that whole stigma. I'm not a recovering addict. I'm just somebody trying to take care of some pain and try to do it in the best way possible to not have to compound the situation of having to go through withdrawal. And my heart's with you, Sonia, for your child, because I can imagine that's horrible. So.
Thank you. Do we have comments from the web?
We had a comment from Justin, who talks about the joint damage that makes, he describes joint damage as making the disorder visible to the world, not only in that there's pain and limiting mobility, but now that there's judgment from others who sees him. And I guess we can maybe potentially ask others in the room whether or not they've experienced similar stigmata related to joint damage, potentially.
Okay. Show of hands, anyone else who's had that same experience? Anyone want to talk about it?
Hi, my name is Paul Brayshaw, severe hemophilia B, factor 9 deficient. A lot of the similar experiences I've faced, I guess some of the ones, the stigma associated with having limping or other inability to walk normally, I guess, was a way to, it was one of the ways I was exposed to the world, especially in like grade school and high school. I think that if I was on crutches and didn't have a cast or some sort of a wrap, I think I was always called a faker, and I'd probably get pushed around for that alone. I think that, and those are the kinds of things that extend through life. Even parking in a disabled parking space, I think people look at you like, oh, you don't have any apparent disability. There's no wheelchair or whatever. And I guess maybe it's something that I experience just from people looking, but I think it's also, you can face comments or other types of, stigma associated that I guess just gets underreported, and it's just part of the day-to-day effects of the pain.
Okay.
I wanted to circle back to pain for just a minute, because most of our hospitalizations over the last 3-4 years have not been because of the bleed, it's been because of the pain. And ultimately, treatment of the pain has snowballed in such that the side effects from the drugs, pain drugs, and vomiting and low heart rate and sedation often become more of a problem than the bleed itself. I mean, I have literally said to an attending doctor, just send me home, I can do the infusions, you're making this worse. And after our experience this past fall, I mean, we're at that stage now where he doesn't want pain medication, and that's hard as a mom to watch, because you know that damage is happening and you want to protect your child. That's your whole job in life, is to protect your child. So yes, there is pain. Have we come far enough in addressing that pain, especially in pediatrics? Absolutely not. And there is stigma, Paul. I mean, I was totally fearful of Thomas going to school in a wheelchair. We're very lucky. We're at a fantastic school. Those kids rally around him and take care of him. But we have had some bullying instances where kids have thrown stuff at him in a wheelchair. And it's tough. It's really tough.
Thank you. Operator, do we have any phone calls?
We do have a call in the queue. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press star 1. Thank you. I'm showing no comments at this time.
Thank you. Okay. So in what we've discussed and what we've spoken, does anybody have a story that they feel like that's a little different that they want to, and I use the word story and I apologize, I don't mean it as if, what's your experience is really what we're saying, that we haven't talked about? Okay. Do my colleagues have any questions they'd like to ask anyone? No? Okay. All right. In serious bleeding, our numbers were, do you have that question? What was the number of symptoms? %? Okay. What about that? I'm sorry, I'm trying to read my notes and I apologize for this. What about serious bleeding? Does anyone have, oh, thank you. I thought we couldn't go back to that. So, as you can see, the various different bleeds there come up to 21% in that. Does anyone have an experience with serious bleeding that they'd like to share? Outside? Okay.
Hi, Paul Brayshaw again. I can share an experience from college. I was actually away at school, about an hour from home, and I had a hand bleed, a right hand bleed, which is my dominant hand, and I was taking Factor, as I would with most bleeds. Growing up, I was mostly on demand, and at this episode, I was just doing the same, had the pain and felt like I would just start with a regular dose, and that was fine, except then it didn't go away, so I took another injection, maybe 2 more, and I ended up not having the bleed resolved, and so I ended up in the emergency room, and I ended up having to have a carpal tunnel release because it was such a significant bleed. It turns out that the medication I was prescribed was for Factor VIII deficiency, not Factor IX. So fortunately, I was able to work through the injury and have full motion of my hand, but it was kind of a significant bleeding episode that just was a mistake from the pharmacist dispensing.
Okay.
My name is Rich. I have moderate hemophilia. And when you talk about stories that are different, I formed an inhibitor at age 18. So usually you hear inhibitors at a younger age. And growing up, I had pretty much no symptoms. You know, my father epitomized, my mom and dad epitomized ice, you know, rice, rest, ice compression, elevation. It was when I had my wisdom teeth out and I went to a non-HTC where the hematologist didn't know how to control the bleeding. So I was exposed to a large quantity of factor VIII and I formed this inhibitor. So I went from managed care to unmanaged care. And during that time, for about 10 years before I was tolerized, I went from everything from neuropathy on my left-hand side to joint damage to forming a clot to frequent infusions. And I think the big thing is that we don't talk about, especially for me, is forming a clot. No one had ever mentioned that someone with hemophilia can form a clot. I had a port in my bicep area and I was on crutches. And because I was not using the crutches the correct way, and because I was on large doses of clotting factor, I woke up in the middle of the night and my whole arm was blue and swollen. And I think that's something as patients, it's not talked about. It's almost taboo that having hemophilia means excessive bleeding. It doesn't mean that you have a tendency or you're at risk for clots. And I think there needs to be more education about that because, especially for those with inhibitors, you're using high doses of clotting factor. And still now that even though the clot has resolved itself, I went a year on Lovenox. So I'm infusing twice a day clotting factor, and then I'm sticking a needle inside of, sub-Q into my stomach, thinning the blood at the same time. So, for a 25-year-old at the time, it's really difficult to manage. So I think, when you ask the question, kind of bleeds that kind of stand out, during the time with the inhibitor, I was on an airplane and the seatbelt was a little tight around my waist and there was some turbulence. I ended up bleeding, into my abdominal area. And that's something, again, that growing up, and I know the inhibitor is a different story, but you don't think about these things. So education about this could really be good.
Thank you. That's really important for us to hear. I saw some other hands up.
Hi, my name's Debbie Porter. I just wanted to follow up on a little bit of what Rich was saying as to we too had a very bad experience with blood clots from the bypassing agents. And I'm actually talking this afternoon, so you'll get to hear a little bit more about that. But I'm pretty active with the inhibitor community in hemophilia, and that is becoming more and more common. And I really think it is something that we really need to think about. My son actually almost died from a blood clot. He has lost both of his subclavian veins. He has no more circulation from his head back to his heart. He spent 3 months in intensive care growing new veins. And this is something we don't think about, and it's very serious. And I do think that the risks with the bypassing agents are significantly contributing to that. The other thing that we don't really have up there when we're talking about severe bleeds is kidney bleeding. And for us, that has been recently our most serious bleeds and the hardest to control because, again, you're trying to treat, but you don't want to clot. I mean, if you clot in the urinary system, you have a big problem. So again, we're having this constant balancing between trying to treat a bleed and trying not to clot.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Mark Saturka. I have severe hemophilia A. And I just wanted to point out that it's not really just serious bleeds that this community faces as well. I was talking to another individual with hemophilia recently, and we were kind of talking about our most embarrassing bleeds. And like Rich said, with a seatbelt on an airplane, my friend was opening a pickle jar and got a serious bleed in his wrist. And a couple years back, just from sitting with my legs crossed for too long. I got an awful bleed in my ankle, and I couldn't walk for like 2 weeks. So it doesn't always take an extremely serious trauma to create a bleed that can really affect, your quality of life. So I just wanted to make that point that, it can be little things as well that can trigger a bleed that really has an impact on your life as well.
Okay. Mark?
I agree with that. I have my doorman open my pickles and olives now because I although they make electric jar openers, but I think the definition of what is a bleed is something that, we're talking about severe bleeds, but there's also bleeds at the other end of the scale that we haven't talked about. So some refer to them as microhemorrhages or microbleeds. And the definition of bleeds that both the FDA uses in terms of its clinical trials and what we're asked when we go into the clinic tend to be those kinds of things that actually manifest themselves as pain, warmth, swelling, tingling, something that you actually have a clinical or a visual sensation for. I think what we don't know is there may be a whole series of things that go on before we know them and have a cumulative effect. I mentioned earlier that I am contemplating a shoulder replacement surgery. I have never had a known trauma or bleed in my shoulder, but if you look at it on x-ray, it's as shot as any of my joints. So undoubtedly something has gone on in that shoulder that has caused the joint destruction, and maybe it's a series of microbleeds. But I think the definitions when we talk about a bleed, we can't just assume those things that are seen. We all run into that trouble even when we go into the emergency rooms. If they don't see blood, they don't think that you're bleeding, and so you go the end of the line. And there's a whole educational problem there. But we shouldn't be thinking about just severe bleeds. We need to be thinking about treatment that actually manages those bleeds that aren't recognized that might have a cumulative effect as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ben Scholdner, and sadly, you're going to have to listen to me later on, so I'll try to keep this brief now. Mark really brings up an interesting question about what is a bleed. I have a really shot left elbow. It hurts most of the time. Is it bleeding? I have no idea. I know it hurts. Maybe it's bleeding sometime, maybe it's not, maybe it's the arthritis, maybe it's the, just joint damage. And I think a lot of us, because pain is a constant thing for us, and because we have target joints, and because we are suffering through all sorts of other issues, it's sometimes unclear, is it an actual acute bleed that is currently going on, or is it just that, we have really bad joints and so it hurts more today than it did yesterday. And so it's hard, like even when the question was asked, previously, how many bleeds have you had this year? I don't know. It really depends, on your definition. And so I appreciate this idea that it's about managing pain, managing joint damage, and if we could ever have a conversation about things like making elbow replacement better, ankle replacement better, those two are really bad joints throughout the community, and the replacement there is not as good as it really could be. And that's something that, though it's not hemophilia per se, it's very important to the community.
Okay, thank you. Saw your hand.
Hi, my name is Don Goldman. I'm a person with severe hemophilia. I'll be on the panel this afternoon, so I won't go into that. But I just want to tell a very quick story. Back in the early 1960s, in those days, my medical insurance would not pay for disease-related emergency room treatment. If it was a disease, it wasn't covered. Like if you had a cold, or if you had asthma, or anything else like that. So if you go there and the reason that you're there is you're bleeding because of hemophilia, there's no coverage. So I decided, I talked to my doctors and I said, well, don't call it hemophilia, call it a microtrauma. And all of a sudden they said, that sounds a good idea. We called it a microtrauma and they covered it. And later on that term began to be used in the orthopedic and physical therapy community. And none of them really understood that it really all derived from insurance company jargon in the first place. I have a question I want to ask everybody, just to raise their hands if they would, with respect to the issue of pain and joint damage. How many of the people here, either them or their loved ones, have used some form of analgesic painkiller within the past week? I don't know how many have not? I mean, I personally, you know, if it weren't for Percocet, I'd be very unhappy. It's a very good thing to get to sleep at night if need be, and sometimes during the day it's necessary to continue.
Well, thank you. We had like a 2 to everybody else kind of ratio there. One more, and then we're going to go to the phone after this next speaker.
I just wanted to bring also to the room and to the discussion today, having friends with children with mild or moderate hemophilia, and having not heard some of that represented today as much. When talking about serious bleeding or episodic treatment versus prophylactic treatment, a lot of times our people affected by hemophilia that have moderate or mild hemophilia that are treating episodically are not treated aggressively enough. And so a bleed that could have been handled very quickly and could have been resolved very quickly actually turns into something that's very serious because of trying to be less aggressive with the therapy and trying in an effort to use less factor. And those means I have 2 personal friends that have adult children now that due to spontaneous cerebral bleeds or brain bleeds are now deficient in their adulthood, and it's something that could have been avoided had they been treated a lot more aggressively. So I just wanted to put that bleeds that may start small generally have the opportunity to become quite a larger scale, and not just in the hemophilia side of it, but impacting the mental capacity of our people.
Thank you. Operator, do we have someone on the line?
I'm not showing any comments at this time.
Okay, do we have any comments from the web?
One of our web participants with von Willebrand disease commented on how severe heavy menses have impacted the quality of her life, specifically causing a lot of anemia and iron deficiency. We had another comment regarding the diagnosis of symptomatic carrier versus, you know, mild or moderate hemophilia just by factor levels, and wanting to, you know, just make the comment that females who are carriers also have symptoms, also experience bleeding episodes, and then our last comment was from a person with actually a pretty rare bleeding disorder who commented that most of her serious bleeds are related to internal organs. So she's had an experience with diverticulitis and a significant GI bleed that has impacted her life.
And we do have one person on the phone, actually, so if operator, you want to open him up. Operator?
Yes, we do have a question or a comment in the queue from Justin. Your line is now open.
Hey, Justin, I mean, it's great to sort of first hearing and seeing people I know over this program, so this is great. But I kind of also wanted to talk a little bit about how, you know, we don't sort of sometimes know whether or not something is a bleed or not. And recently, you know, I've had the experience of having some pretty intense elbow bleeding occur, and went to a specialist to sort of have that be looked at it. And this guy is telling me that, oh, no, you're not bleeding there. And I'm trying to tell the physician that, you know, this is a bleed. I can tell you right now that, you know, my arm would be moving more extension if I wasn't having a bleed, and I can tell the difference between what is the arthritic pain and what is the joint pain or what is a bleed. So I sort of think sometimes there's this opposition from physicians to sort of minimize our knowledge of this experience, what, you know, they're hoping to prescribe to you for a treatment plan.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Real quick, a couple of you have mentioned that sometimes you don't, you know, your bleeding is not obvious. Do you have any symptoms, or do you kind of know when you have a bleed, even though there's nothing, none of the normal or what's usually discussed that you want to mention or talk about to us? Share?
A 2-year-old gets real cranky before you see a bleed. Real cranky.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that my son, he's 4 now, and 2-year-old gets real cranky. The 4-year-old, when it's first starting, he kind of tries to hide it at first because he knows he's going to get his port accessed. He knows I'm probably going to leave it accessed, and he doesn't want it left accessed. So he'll usually start with a hint of a limp, and he'll try to hide that, and he'll go find something to do and sit down somewhere to try to hide that. But for adults, I'm sure that's different.
Wait a minute, we're going to talk to someone we've not heard from real quick.
I was going to agree. I can notice the limb. My son is 7. I can notice when he's limping at the hip or the knee or the ankle before he even realizes he's doing it and tries to overcorrect so he doesn't have to stop. But you did ask about symptoms that aren't common, that have been spoken about. And I wanted to mention my son had a head bleed when he was 16 months old. And I missed the symptom that would have told me he was having it a week earlier and not led to such bad things had I known. There was some facial twitching. So there were different signs that I saw in him that I had not been aware of. And we were new to the community, no family history. So I think it's important maybe to collect some of that data and information so that others know there are less known symptoms of bleeds that are very serious.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we got 2 people. We're going to go Christopher, and then we'll go to you, Dan.
Chris Templin again. I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing me. But Mark was very good. Microbleeds, I think, that's an area that's underlooked. I have a lot of microbleeds in my head, not a place where you want to bleed. And when I think something's really going on and it's not being taken care of by clotting factor, it's sort of a pain to go to the hospital and say, I need an MRI in my head. And they say, you look fine. You walked in here. Everything's good. Your eyes, pupils ain't dilated. And it's like, I know something's wrong. I've had blood clots, subdural hematomas, spent months and months in the hospital, almost died, and I didn't. So microbleeding is a big thing. And the mild hemophiliacs, I have 6%. I prophy treat. I catch heck because I prophy treat. How can you prophy treat? You have mild hemophilia. Well, if I don't prophy treat, I'm going to be laying on the couch rest 24 hours a day and not be productive to anybody, not be productive to myself or my family. And ain't nobody carrying me to the bathroom except King Kong. So, so many issues I think need to really be looked at. Even to go to an HTC, I really like to see HHS or FDA or some MCHB or some alphabet designation really go to the treatment centers and go to the emergency rooms and say, look, if Johnny shows up with hemophilia, don't make him sit in the back of the queue. Take him in, get him his factor, get him what he wants. Call his treating physician. The doctor there that walks in and says, how long have you had hemophilia? I want to just walk out, but I'm already there. I've had it since birth. Or maybe that party last week, I might have picked it up there. I don't really remember. But, and I'm not trying to make jokes about it, but it is sort of comical because I went to my clinic appointment a few months ago, and I'm due for another one, and the resident walks in and asks me how long I had hemophilia. And I wanted to smack him with the closest thing to me because you're a resident in training to become a hematologist. I think you should know how long these people have had hemophilia. I didn't just acquire it. I was born with it.
Okay. Thank you. Dan?
I just want to say my girlfriend can often recognize when I'm having a bleed before I'm at least willing to admit it. So to the parents, it doesn't get any easier.
Great.
Thanks. We're going to take, we're going to take 2 more questions. Or statements.
Statements. The kids, when they're younger, they get cranky and they stop using the joint. That's the first time I recognized my son had an ankle bleed. He would, instead of walking, he would crawl. He would know that. And also, my sons, as they got older, they say they feel like a tingling in the joints right before the bleed starts, and they would recognize it that way. But one comment I want to make about pain is, before my dad passed away, he got his 3 daughters, and we sat, and he was telling, we knew all about his experience, but he said, whatever you do, make sure you take care of the pain. I don't want my grandchildren to suffer the way I did. He did not have access to the medicines that they do now. And that's the one thing we're very vigilant about is the pain. But they have developed such a high tolerance, we almost have to force them to take something because we know they're suffering. So just wanted to make that comment as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Jeanette with von Willebrand's disease, and I just was thrilled to, listen to your answer about what is a bleed. I was dying to know what your answer was because I think that's a big confusion, and I think with my experience, my family's experience with von Willebrand's disease, I looked at your thing and it said 12 bleeds is this. So if we are infusing factor every month to control our period, does that instantly put us in the 12 times, just baseline? Because I'll tell you, it sure seems like a bleed to me. Now, whether it qualifies, I don't know. And again, I think this is one of the things we need to look at to help document and validate the bleeding that we're experiencing. And also, I think we need more education within for mothers and for young adults growing up about what is a bleed, how to identify it. I mean, typically, von Willebrand's isn't supposed to have muscle bleeds, isn't supposed to have these different things. And, I miss it. I miss it when my child comes to me and is having a legitimate muscle bleed, but I'm going to the orthopedist looking for a broken bone. And, we learn as we go along, but it would be much better to get this information up front so we're aware of these things coming up. And so that concept of defining what is a bleed, that's not language typically von Willebrand's knows, but yet we experience.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think we have a couple more web comments, and then we're going to move on to a next question.
Is this okay? So one comment on the web talked about a woman whose daughter was diagnosed at 15 years of age. She had a slow internal bleed, and just her concern around the difficulty of diagnosis. She has von Willebrand's disease, and that other physicians were really slow to pick up these symptoms. Another individual talks about the challenges related to labeling hemophiliacs with different levels of severity, mild, moderate, and severe, especially for those who have mild disease, because their symptoms are often overlooked. And a third participant talks about her 8-year-old son and how she knows that he is having a bleed because he talks about this buzzing, I think, sensation.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about bleeds and joint damage. Are there other symptoms or other issues not identified in the polling that anyone wants to talk about or share? Okay.
I have von Willebrand's disease, and my 2 main severe symptoms have been menorrhagia and GI bleeding. I had severe GI hemorrhaging for over 2.5 years before they finally could figure out something to do to stop it. And I have found that most physicians discount me when I come in and say, this is happening, I have a bleed, 1, because I'm female, 2, because it's von Willebrand's disease, and many people think that you can only have mild symptoms with von Willebrand's disease, and 3, because they don't know anything about it. No one except for my hematologist and my GI doctor really knew about my bleeding disorder. So even though it's not talked about, the more common symptoms for people with bleeding disorders, there can be others. It turns out I also have Crohn's disease on top of the bleeding disorder. But to me, I mean, that doesn't matter. I was still dealing with this. And I found that, as many people have pointed out, most physicians were not educated enough that they could know that a person with a bleeding disorder could have such severe GI symptoms.
Thank you. Right behind you.
My name's Randy Curtis, and I'm 60 years old with severe 8. And one of the things that I've had trouble with is gout. And as we get older, we start having these other old man diseases that come along with hemophilia, and they get kind of tricky because if you have gout and you have a bleed in the same joint, the bleed doesn't respond to factor because it's actually gout, and the gout irritates it's a mess. And then of course your favorite treatment center says, well, you must have developed an inhibitor. It's like, no, I don't have an inhibitor. There's something else going on in here. So then you have to get the rheumatologist involved in it. And as we age, we're going to be, we're having more and more challenges with heart disease and diabetes and all those kind of things that come with age. And there really haven't been a lot of us around this long to kind of explore those extra areas.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Oh, well, well, I just had to look forward. All right, we'll go in this order.
So your earlier chart where you were asking sort of about major symptoms, I think the last column was anxiety and depression. And I think there's an issue that probably hasn't been raised, which is the whole psychosocial side of this. Our healthcare system is squeezing the ability for us as patients to access psychosocial support really out of our care system. And I would expect most of us, and it's humbling to sit up here and hear all the stories out here, because we're probably our best therapy and support group is talking to each other, which is why we are such a close community. But we don't, I would guess all of us worry at some level about our kids in school, about our careers and our jobs, and all of that is because of the underlying condition. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of the psychosocial impacts of just the burden of living with disease, because that last number I recall was like 11%. I think it's something that we just assume we have to cope with and deal with. Mm-hmm. But if we really were able to treat and develop therapies that allowed a normal life, it would fix that number. So I didn't want that small number to underestimate the importance of that to all of us. And I'm happy for my colleagues and brothers and sisters in the community to disagree with me, but I expect it's a bigger problem than the data show.
Thanks, Mark. I suspect, too, if we were able to pick more than one, it probably would have been higher. Daniel?
Another issue that's sort of masked by the bleeding disorders, I've had 3 bouts of septic arthritis in my knees and one in one of my replaced elbows. And they present very much like just an ordinary bleed. They swell up, a lot of pain, but it doesn't respond to factor. And after I had the 3 in my knees, I had my knees replaced. Years later, got my elbow replaced, and I called my doctor and I said, I think my elbow's infected. And he immediately called the orthopedist, called the emergency room. I was in surgery within 4 hours of telling him that. He didn't examine me. He said, if Dan says it's infected, it's probably infected. And the orthopedist said that he'd never saved a replaced joint from an infection. But because I was able to get in so quickly, he saved it.
Thank you. Can't imagine that. And we'll go back to you. Go ahead.
So I was going to speak a little bit about postpartum bleeding. I have 3 children. I have 2 daughters, one older, one younger than my son Thomas. And so with my older daughter, I was not diagnosed yet as mild hemophilia, and I bled for 9 months postpartum and was told that was normal. And of course was anemic and was taking iron. And with Thomas, I don't remember bleeding as much postpartum, but I was also dealing with a new diagnosis, so I probably did. But with my 3rd child, we had already established my factor activity level at 26% and went in with a plan if I had bleeding. And had significant bleeding with my 3rd child, and again had to fight. Even though I had the factor in my hand, my OBGYN refused to sign off on me being able to infuse it. So I think there's still a real problem with postpartum bleeding for women that also have bleeding disorders.
Thank you.
I wanted to add to what Mark was saying. When you put up the slide and ask what had impacted us the most, and I'm looking at that thinking joint bleeds and joint damage concern, but also I was really thinking I should lean towards the anxiety and depression. And in looking at that, we raised this next generation to know that their products are theoretically, they're pure, they're safe, and you get to do whatever you want, and you get to go fulfill your dreams for those kids that are blessed to not be affected by inhibitors. But it puts so much pressure on them as well, looking at, well, I'm going to have my children, I'm supposed to live this normal life. No one can see that I have hemophilia, but yet I do have limitations to the things that I can do. So I think the anxiety and depression is something that we're seeing in our next generation that looks so normal and so part of everyday, normal being in quotations, Mark, because I agree. I think normals should always have these in the air. But I think that's going to be something that we see in this next generation that we may not expect because we think they should have everything so much better than our generations past have.
Okay, thank you. Does the web have anything they'd like to share?
We do have a caller again, so operator, if you can open up the line.
Yes, Justin, your line is now open.
So it's Justin again, and a lot of times I think to some extent it's important to sort of talk about those anxiety issues and how depression sort of impacts people with bleeding disorders. And sometimes I think it's important to sort of understand that disability is not just a medical condition or a body infirmity, but it's sort of a set of social and cultural barriers to the full participation in social life, whether that be the pressures of fully participating in a sort of masculine world, and I think especially coming from a predominantly male-affected community, those issues sort of begin to be even more compounded, and especially even within the bleeding disorders community, how we sort of look at that and not include women or people with mild hemophilia sort of in those parameters as well.
Okay, we're going to go to, thank you so much for that, Justin. Then we'll go to the web.
We have one participant that wanted to share that even though her son has a diagnosis of severe hemophilia, he hasn't had many complications. And so really it's just the stigma of having the diagnosis. But to date, he's had a pretty disease or complication-free experience. And so that might be something that we could explore.
Okay, thanks. We're going to take one more comment, and then we're going to get to my next question.
I'd like to address what would have been my second choice, which is bleeding in the head, and is the reason I'm here today. About 9 years ago, my older brother, racquetball accident, head trauma. He's conscious in the ER with his wife and 2 daughters sitting there with him. They come in and they say, the CT scan says that your bleeding in your head has stopped. A few minutes, they had not infused him. A few minutes later, his head blew up, he went into a coma, and subsequently died. It's very important that we get into, I don't know if FDA can do this, we get into the process in ERs and the urgency of infusing stat. The mentality is the stroke mentality. We have a golden hour. We CT first. It's either a clot or a bleed. We treat accordingly. With hemophiliacs, that's not the issue. Infuse stat. We need to get that to ERs. I'm going to work on getting an app to do it, but or any other mechanism. That's very important. I don't know if FDA can influence that, but if you can, please do.
Thank you. I see that we have other comments and questions, but I'd like to get to my next question, which is really, how have the effects of bleeding changed as you've aged? How have the symptoms changed? Anybody?
I don't think the symptoms have changed. Chris Templin, again, for the record. I don't think the symptoms of bleeding has changed, but I think that what has changed is the stigma. You're a big guy, suck it up, get over it. And for me, it's the fear of, I'm a person with a good support system, but my fear is the people without a good support system. Going back to anxiety and depression and pain, people might not go get the help they need because they're afraid of the stigma that comes along with it. And then they'll self-medicate or self-treat that pain or depression or anxiety. And that's what scares me, because this, I have a bleed, I take care of it, and I act accordingly. But we're sort of taught to trust the doctors, trust the HTCs, trust that our treatment centers are on par. But I can tell you right now, I could walk into any one treatment center in one part of the country and probably walk into another one in another part, and I'll get totally two different standards of care. What changes? I have to be more of an advocate now and take more of a heavy-duty advocate role than I do having to worry about a bleed. I have a bleed, I just infuse. I just do what I need to do.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Shelby Smoke. I have severe B. And to address that question, I think I would concur with the ability or the necessity of being your own advocate. But in terms of how it's changed from when I was younger, as I've aged, now we're looking at severe joint damage. So recovery times are a lot longer. And a lot of times this doesn't necessarily get addressed in treatment protocols. So when I was a kid with elbow bleeds, my recovery period might be, 24, 48 hours. Now that recovery period can be weeks, and I think the treatment is necessarily much more intensive. And sometimes if you aren't aggressive, then those bleeds just linger and linger. And the consequence of that is, you're losing activity. And if you're trying to stay healthy and be active and keep your muscle tone well to reduce joint damage, you're losing that. So that's a kind of a manifold system of decay that happens as you age, especially in, with the joint damage that you've accrued.
Okay, thank you. Well, what continues to worry you about your health as you get older? I'm sorry, what continues to worry you about your health as you get older?
Probably, I'm Val Bias, I'm the CEO for the National Hemophilia Foundation. Probably our ability to access product. Chris said that, he's mild and he's treating prophylactically. Well, there's no indication for that. So at some point, he's going to have a problem with his insurer, and they're not going to believe him, or he's not going to get the product, and then he will be on the couch. As the new products come out, our ability, especially in this healthcare transition, to access products that work better for us becomes sort of a roll of the dice at the moment. Are they going to cover the new products that are going to come out? What difference does it make if you license them if we can't access them? It's sort of a catch-22. We've made a lot of progress in the last 25, 30 years, but what difference does it make when we look down the line and we say, hey, there might be a cure for hemophilia, but they're not going to pay for it?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm right here.
Thanks. I would say that personally, the biggest fear about my condition is that the inhibitor is going to come back. My heart breaks when I hear stories like Sandra's and Debbie's son. For 10 years, you go through this awful experience, and I almost feel that I'm lucky now that I could live at 31 years old and be active and run and, infuse every other day. But in the back of my mind, I always am fearful that this inhibitor is going to come back. And I think another thing that is concerned that I mentioned earlier is neuropathy. The pain of nerve damage by far was more severe than any joint bleed or muscle bleed that I ever had. When I did experience it, I didn't know what it was. And I can remember screaming in the middle of the night and having to be hospitalized for about 2 months. And still now I can't sit for long periods of time. And this is 7 years later because this area still gets inflamed like a pins and needles type of thing. And I've gone to acupuncture. I've been on Lyrica. I've been on all different types of drugs, heat, the TENS unit, everything. And these complications are less talked about, but they're all, it's not a side effect of hemophilia, but it's a result of having bleeds. And especially when you're talking about muscle bleeds, it could really turn into other things. So those are the types of complications that, because there is no cure for hemophilia, these are the things that as a patient that you worry about when a bleed is uncontrollable.
Thank you. I'd like to suggest you stand up.
Oh, okay, Amanda.
I was going to say, well, actually, to, I guess, piggyback off of what Rich says, my biggest concern is that the inhibitor will never go away. We've been doing it for 3 years now, and I've gotten to know Sonja, and I love her, but, you know, her story doesn't make me very hopeful. But, and as I said before, my brother had severe hemophilia A with an inhibitor, and kind of going off of what Val said, I also always have in the back of my mind that someday the insurance company is going to say, sorry, you can't infuse him every day. So, and, you know, that's just another worry that we have. And, you know, I don't know that that will happen, but it's always in the back of my head.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, I mean, for people that were listening that didn't know our community, this could be awfully depressing. I want to pick up on Randy's comment about the aging issue. So, I mean, there are some problems that we never expected to have because we weren't supposed to live this long. But cardiovascular disease hasn't been mentioned yet. So, I mean, as we think about things that cause us to have a sedentary life because of the joint damage, obesity we know is a bigger problem in our community than the general population. Many of us have been on heart therapies through the HIV drugs, and cardiovascular disease in patients aging with hemophilia is not well understood. And so interventions to manage cardiovascular disease, so many of the typical interventions are contraindicated with the hemophilia. So I worry about it because there's a long history of cardiovascular disease in my family. I've been on the HIV meds for a very long period of time, and I wonder how some of these sort of lifestyle aging issues, whether we're prepared to manage them as we go forward. So.
Okay, thank you. Let me get over here real quick.
Sure, Mark Antel. I'm 67 years old, and I've noticed over the last decade, maybe even longer, that slowly I've needed additional factor. I don't know if that's because my joints have gotten worse, just an accumulation of joint damage over the years, or maybe muscle tension has reduced. But certainly in my experience, and I think it's not all that unusual that as we get older, we find that we need more factor. We need to treat more frequently.
Thank you. Can we go to the web? Any comments we have there?
So we have comments about increased symptoms as our participants age, including easy bruising, increased joint damage. There are concerns about insurance and insurance coverage, issues with mechanisms for retirement. One participant commented that for hemophiliacs in particular, there really isn't a mechanism for early retirement other than disability. And then there are complications from treatments that are still major concerns for some of our participants.
Thank you. Is anything that's been said give our panel any questions that they want to ask? Stephanie?
I'm curious as to some ways that you cope or deal with some of your symptoms aside from treatment. What are some things that are helping? I was very interested to hear that that it's not always just pain. You can sense tingling before you see a bleed. There are ways that you sense bleeds, but what are some ways that you're sort of coping or helping these symptoms that are not related to treatment?
I'll answer that. We keep a 20-pound bag of ice in our freezer at all times. Ice is a huge friend, and there's some controversy amongst our physical therapist friends in the hemophilia community whether or not that's best, but I'm kind of the opinion if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and it works for us. So ice is a huge help for us, and in fact, it's oftentimes the first thing we turn to in times of pain, more so than medication.
Thanks.
Yeah, ask how many hemophiliacs in here use Celebrex or something like Celebrex.
And there they go. Anybody else?
Yeah. Since Paul Brasher hasn't raised his hand, he's more of a physical fitness fanatic than I am. Exercise, exercise, exercise to the extent you can. A lot of people have taken up swimming. I do the bicycle because my body won't let me run anymore. And bicycles are very, very common among hemophiliacs as a form of exercise. But exercise is extremely important. It helps you in general. It's just better for your overall physiology and helps with the bleeds as soon as you can get away from the injury.
Thank you, and thanks, Steve, for mentioning that. I definitely find exercise to be a good alternative to the joint pain, and trying to maintain the strength of muscles that protect the joints has been a big part of my life. Stretching has also been a huge piece too, and I think just trying to maintain the range of motion helps keep the mobility and the joint functional. So that's very important.
Okay, thanks. Paul, did you have a question?
Yes, the textbooks tell us that stress can be related to bleeding. And I'm wondering if the experience here in the room bears that out or not.
I'll chime in again first. There's going to be a bleed on a holiday. There's going to be bleeds at 5 o'clock on Friday night. There's going to be bleeds around back to school. I mean, there's almost some that you just know are coming. And I think it's in high part to stress.
Thanks.
Change topics now. Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Haugstead. I'm with the Hemophilia Federation of America. I also have a 12-year-old son with severe hemophilia. And just to play on what Paul said, and maybe it's relevant, my son does actively engage in a sporting activity. He does Taekwondo. And he has since kindergarten. We actually enrolled him because the discipline was important. He's a pretty dominant little guy. We were hoping that would help. And he also was incredibly awkward, and we were seeing an awful lot of issues with him, and we're worried about him being physically, challenged by his awkwardness. I hope this is not recorded and he reads it later. We have found, yeah, I know, right? We have found that he has experienced several bleeds from doing the activity of Taekwondo. He's gotten a thigh bleed, he's gotten a wrist bleed, several finger bleeds. However, over the years that he has been doing Taekwondo, because his balance and his general health and his just physical fitness has been so ingrained, I'm absolutely convinced that he has avoided many bleeds. But it's a tough thing to really say. I mean, we know that we've gotten bleeds because of Taekwondo, but I don't have evidence to suggest that strength has prevented it. I'm certain it has.
Thank you. I see a couple hands up, so I want to take a little bit of time to let you speak, but I will say we're getting very close to the wrapping up time before we go to lunch, and I know you all do not want to miss lunch. Or maybe that's me.
I just want to answer the question of what else, besides just clotting factor for treating bleeds. Again, I'm coming from the inhibitor perspective, so it's a little bit different, but we have found that a surgical procedure is necessary most of the time. Once we develop a target joint, the bypassing therapies really aren't effective at that point to control bleeding, and we have had to resort to synovectomies.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment on the stress-induced bleeding. I guess it piggybacks on something we talked about earlier, but it's definitely a common experience for me. And I also find just the arthritic pain creates stress, not being able to walk and having that pain throughout the morning or until my ankles loosen up. But I think that in and of itself creates some anxiety that I'm going to bleed worse, and I usually end up doing just that. So I think it kind of all is part of that same cascade.
Okay, thank you. Anybody who's not spoken want to say something? All right, we're going to go to both of you.
Yeah, I find if I get all stressed out, I start to bleed a little bit more in the neck because the neck muscles get all tight and tense. But sort of complementary medicine other than factor, TENS units, compounded pain creams with like ketamine. I live on a farm, so I got a lot of access to veterinary type medications. So like horse liniments and stuff like that seem to work, and you can buy a lot of that stuff at the farm supply store. But aquatherapy, that's something the insurance wouldn't want to pay for, but I did it. And how do you do aquatherapy on your head? I learned how to scuba dive, so I can sit at the bottom of the pool and actually stretch my neck a lot better than the chiropractor could, which saved me a lot of having to additionally infuse by going to the chiropractor. So physical therapy worked as well, but aquatherapy was really the key, and I took that on the initiative to learn how to scuba dive so I could go under the water.
Go ahead.
There was a comment earlier about receiving factor 8 when you were factor 9 deficient. Do you have any ideas about ways that could be addressed? Is there something that could be done with maybe product labeling that would help the physician understand that better? Just a general question.
I'm actually glad you asked. That was kind of a comment I was going to make, which is I can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that this event is occurring and that you are being respectful to the folks that deal with the issues every day. What is problematic that you hear with so many of these stories is there's a lack of trust from the professionals to the folks that actually have the disease. And if there is any way, and I don't know how this is even physically possible, but when you hear about a gentleman dying because they didn't get their medicine, when they know full well they should do their medicine, when you hear about mislabeling, when they could have just said, I know that I'm factor 8 or factor 9, or when any of these other issues, if there's any way to say, look, in a community like this, where you hear such articulate people that understand this disease so well and understand all the complications, if there's a way that the professionals that are here to support us can trust the patient, trust the families, so many things would be better for all of us.
Thank you.
I could respond to Jonathan specifically.
Okay.
So there has been some work done to actually suggest moving away from Roman numerals to cardinal numerals. That the 8 and the 9 can be very confusing, and if people aren't accustomed to working in those numbers, to either look at treatment for hemophilia A, treatment for hemophilia B, or use the cardinal numbers versus Roman numerals, that might eliminate some of the medication errors when they're prescribing.
Thank you. Well, I think that is a good time for us to wrap up. We're going to go to lunch. We'll give you an hour if you could come back at 1:45 at 12:45. There is a kiosk if you did not bring your lunch. I have heard that sometimes it gets a little long, but we will look forward to seeing you back here in an hour.